The Amazon of black market drug sales, the dark web, and the most wanted man on the web, Ross Ulbricht, a.k.a. Dread Pirate Roberts. The epic hunt for the criminal mastermind behind the Silk Road, and then we'll hear from the mother of Ross. Ross now serving a life sentence without parole. First up, Nick Bilton is a special correspondent for Vanity Fair, where he writes about politics, technology, business, and culture. He's a columnist for the New York Times for about a decade, and he wrote the New York Times bestseller, Hatching Twitter. This new book is American Kingpin, the epic hunt for the criminal mastermind behind the Silk Road. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
It's like an astounding Silicon Valley growth story with the most unsuspecting person. Before we dive in, explain to people what the dark web is, how we would find it, and then the brilliance between the browser and the bitcoins for keeping everything off the grid.
So the dark web was originally built actually by the U.S. government to enable people who were serving overseas to be able to, go on the internet and email their friends and family, and even, people within the government without having to worry about being tracked by, let's say you were in Iraq, by the Iraqi government or whatever it was. And it, it was put out there publicly so you could download it using what's called the Tor web browser. And it quickly became used for nefarious purposes. Today, it was built several years ago. Today, 95% of things that take place through Tor, which is how you access the dark web, are drug and gun and websites and things like that.
Could you or I easily download this browser and get on it?
Oh, and anyone can download it. Yeah, it's free. There's no rules around it. You just download Tor and then you go to Google and Google how to get on these websites, and you'll find a dozen of them. And when the Silk Road started, which is the website that my book is about, there was not any of these things really existed. The dark web was mainly kind of just for people who had, issues believing that the government was tracking them or who were using it for real purposes too, in the intended way it was supposed to be used. And when the Silk Road was started, you could then use it to buy drugs and other things.
All right, tell us the scope of Silk Road and what was built there.
So the Silk Road originally started off, it was the guy who built it, his name was Ross Ulbricht, and he was a really sweet kid from Austin, Texas, and he always kind of had this philosophy, a very libertarian philosophy, that the government shouldn't really be able to tell people what they can and cannot do with themselves and their lives and their bodies and so on. And so he looked at the current drug situation where, millions of people have been arrested and tens of hundreds of thousands thrown in jail for buying and selling drugs or doing drugs. And often what ends up happening is that these people get they get in trouble for buying very mild things like marijuana and magic mushrooms. And so he decided to build a website that you could go and anonymously buy and sell these things.
Now, he wrote a lot of the code himself, and it's almost like an Amazon or an eBay. It's pretty complex stuff. But he wasn't a coder, right? He was a physics major. How did he pull that off?
He was incredibly smart, incredibly kind. He was the kid that would stop and help old ladies across the street mid-sentence, and he was able to kind of take on any new project and figure out how to do it. He decided when he was building the website that he was he figured out how to do the front end and the back end code. The design, the whole system of using Bitcoin, which is the currency that you could use to buy and sell the drugs, really complicated stuff. I mean, I write in the book that if it were a startup in Silicon Valley, it probably would have needed $10 million in funding and a team of a dozen people, and Ross did it all himself. And then at the same time, just to kind of, there's another example of how clever he was, he needed what he called product for his site to prove that it would work. And so he went and grew magic mushrooms. And from all the people I've spoken to that have grown magic mushrooms at scale, it is not an easy thing to do. And yet he was able to do that too.
This libertarianism, which sort of underlies his idealism here, and yet what results is, bringing in drugs 100 times the level of power with fentanyl, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a sweet guy. You've called him that several times. How does this balance out?
Well, I think what happened is, for in the same way that, one analogy to it is that on the internet, on social media, for example, on Twitter, people sometimes say things that are really vicious and things that they would never say to someone in real life. And it's because there's no empathy on the internet. You can't see how the things that you do and say and the way you act is affecting other people. And I think that parallels to the Silk Road and the website that he built. I think that, in his mind, he thought that he was making the world a better and safer place. In some respects he was, and we can get to that in a little bit, but in other respects he wasn't. And what happened was, you've seen this, and you can look on any number of studies or, reports on these things, but there has been a rise in drug overdoses of fentanyl, which is this drug that is, as you said, 100 times stronger than heroin. And the only way that people got it in the very early days was and it's made in China in these labs where there's no regulation, and they were buying it through these dark web websites, and it was cheaper, and they could get tiny little amounts sent in the mail, and they didn't have any idea how strong it was. And as a result, thousands of people have died from it. And there were people who overdosed from the Silk Road that bought drugs on there, including a teenager in Perth. Mm-hmm. But Ross never was able to see those things. He only wanted to see the positive side of this.
Did his ambition run amok, or how did he justify this stuff in his head? And I know there's people who say, well, people get killed on Craigslist and McDonald's kills people, so he's just building this platform.
Well, there's a very justifiable response that a lot of people have in this kind of libertarian philosophy, which is, I didn't make you take those drugs, so it's not my fault. And I think that that's kind of a bit of a justification. It's, that Silicon Valley is known for this too, with things like Uber. The CEO of Uber, Travis Kalanick, used to say the same exact things about people losing their jobs. He's like, well, it's not my fault. And I think, Ross said the same thing. The one thing that I do think happened with Ross over time was that there were two things that happened. One is he kind of became drunk on power. He was running this website that was doing tens of millions of dollars in transactions. He was making millions and millions of dollars in profits. And in his mind, he was doing what he'd set out to do, which was making it safer for people to buy and sell drugs. And so there were those two things that I think came together. And he truly believed, and he'd written this to people he worked with and mentioned it to others, that one day he would prove to the world that he could legalize drugs using the internet, and that he would be able to take his mask off one day and say he was the guy that did it.
And we'll get later to some of those values seem to go by the wayside when he authorized murder for hire and things like that, allegedly. And in terms of money, he had something like $80 million in Bitcoins when they finally got caught. Tell us, what is Dread Pirate Roberts and his mentor, Variety Jones? And then the next segment, we'll get into the thriller of the whole deal.
So as with any good startup that starts to do well, you need to hire people to help build the products and manage the services and so on. And Ross was no different. And so he hired a small group of people at first that kind of grew over time, and some of them would manage the servers, and some of them would build new code for new features, and others would deal with customer complaints just like eBay or Craigslist did. And one guy who he brought on was a guy who went by the name Variety Jones, became kind of like his conciliaire, and he offered guidance. He was very clever, very funny. They spoke, for hours and hours upon time on using a thing called Tor Chat, which is also an anonymous chat program. And Variety Jones one day came up with an idea that Ross should rename himself the Dread Pirate Roberts, and it's from the Princess Bride movie. And the concept was that eventually, when Ross wanted to pass along the website, if he ever wanted to, the person who took it over could remain Dread Pirate Roberts, and no one would ever know who started it, who finished it, and so on and so forth. And it actually became the crux of Ross's defense when he was finally caught a few years later.
But this guy, Variety Jones, unlike Ross, was not a sweet guy, right? This is a really bad dude.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if anyone is a sweet guy or a bad dude in the whole thing. For example, Variety Jones had no problem, pushing Ross to put a hit out on one of his employees, at least what he thought was a hit on one of his employees, because the employee had allegedly stolen $350,000 and all these other things. And so he said, he started referring to him as the organ donor and pushed Ross to put a hit out on him. But at the same time, when Ross was, pushing to sell more heroin on the website in bulk, Variety Jones pushed back, and he had said, I've seen the effects of heroin firsthand when I was in prison, and I think it's just an awful, awful drug. And so it's really fascinating. You had this thing that started to happen on the website that was one of the things that Ross had never anticipated in the beginning, which was you had people that were selling weed seeds and mushrooms, and then you had people that started selling guns and other weapons, and then you had the heroin people, and they all disliked each other. They all thought what the other person was doing was wrong. The weed people wanted to be nowhere near the gun guys because they were bad, and the heroin people thought the weed people were pathetic. And this was one of the things that came about. It's so funny how we all have these different views of what is right and what is wrong.
The hunt for this guy sort of started over one pink pill that a young kid who worked for ICE, the Customs and Enforcement Agency. Start to take us through the epic hunt and how law enforcement got their arms around this thing.
So it's interesting because it started for almost by accident. I got to visit when I was reporting the book. I got to visit all the different places that the mail comes into the United States, and it comes on regular planes sometimes, and it's packed next to your luggage and so on a flight from Amsterdam, and I got to follow. There was one pink pill that kind of started the whole thing, and it was this agent. His name was Jared Reagan, and he worked for the Department of Homeland Security, and he was a newbie. He'd only been on the job a couple of months, and they found him and another guy found a pink pill that came in a package from Amsterdam, and it turned out to be ecstasy. And to really put it into perspective, this tiny pink pill, the mail facilities where the mail is sorted, they're multiple football field sizes big, and they're stacked. They're almost like they look like the end scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it's and they find this pill and they go to the person's house who had ordered it, and that was how they first learned about the Silk Road, and they almost didn't believe it was real. It was like, how can anyone be so brazen to start a website where you can buy and sell drugs on the internet? And so this started one aspect of the investigation, and then there were other people of the country from other departments, the IRS, the Department of Homeland Security, the DEA, FBI, that all started their own separate cases. And what's so dramatic about the story, and even if you know how it ends, it means nothing, because the drama really is in the telling of the way these things all kind of come together and the competition between these law enforcement agencies, and some of them even start working for the Silk Road and turn bad. The agencies don't play all that well together, do they? No, they do not. And I think part of that is people get into this because they want to make a difference, but they also want to make a name for themselves, and so they all want to make sure that they're the one that breaks the case and they're the one that gets the reward and the promotion and so on. And then there are other aspects of it where for people who are not necessarily interested in the reward and the promotion, but they are mired in the government bureaucracy that exists. And I think that that this was a perfect example of that. The DEA had never done a drug case where they'd used Bitcoin or busted someone on the internet, and the FBI had never done drug cases for people selling drugs on the internet, even though they'd done cybersecurity and so on. And they really all started kind of competing with each other, and it got a little vicious. And at one point, there's this DEA agent and a Secret Service agent who start stealing Bitcoins during the investigation and almost get away with a couple $1 million worth of money.
I got a sense too that's interesting. A lot of these things were sort of hunches, like Jared's work. Normally, nobody in drug enforcement looks for one pill, and they kind of smell these things out. The IRS guy, Gary Alford, was kind of interesting. He used kind of a son of Sam, which is he got caught by a parking picket on his car. It was a kind of looking for cyber prints, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. They all took different approaches, and one of the things that I've tried to do with all of the books that I've written, I did this with my last book on Twitter, is that in the hindsight in an investigation or in a story or creation, there's usually one person that ends up taking the credit for everything, and this is no different with this. And the reality is that they all contributed, even the bad guys. To the investigation, and without everyone doing what they had done, they never would have caught Ross at the keyboard. Jared went and worked undercover for Ross on the website. Gary Alford found this clue that led back to him from the early days of the creation of the site. The FBI agents found the server. There's all these different things that happen that come together in this very tense and dramatic moment in the book. But it is really interesting that they all kind of came to it from a completely different approach, and those approaches all kind of came together in essentially a perfect storm to solve the case.
So how does Ross get to the stage where he's either so stressed or anxiety ridden that a sweet guy from Texas can authorize cold-blooded murders that he thought were actually happening?
I think that there's it's the same kind of mentality. And look, I can't speak for exactly what was going through his mind, but from the research I've done and the chat logs I looked at that he was a part of, and the diary entries and so on, the best way I kind of can see it is that when Steve Jobs ran Apple, there was an insane demand for the iPhone, and at the same time Google was making its phone, its Android devices, and they were ramping up to compete with Apple, and so Steve Jobs knew that they needed to make sure as many people could get access to a phone as quickly as possible, because that was going to be the future of their business for decades. And people get locked into these platforms. And as a result, in the phone plants in China, people were committing suicide because they were working 16, 17, 18-hour days. Yeah. And I think that Apple's thought with this was, okay, well, this is just a sacrifice we have to make in business. It sucks. But this is just what we have to do if we're going to win. And I think Ross had the same mentality, which was, I don't want to do this to people, but they are threatening the business that I have built and this institution, which is potentially going to have one of the biggest impacts on the world in decades. And if someone has to die as a result, then that's just the decision I have to make. And I think he struggled with it. It was incredibly difficult, but at the end of the day, I think he felt himself justified in it.
Now, he at one point looked at building a backup plan if he had to escape. He went to a place called Dominica, which I'd never heard of. Do you think that if he had taken a measure like that, or are there other measures that he could have taken where he wouldn't have gotten caught, or is this just inevitable that you're going to get surrounded eventually?
Well, I think that the only way you don't get caught is if you stop. It's hard for them to catch you as you're doing it. There was Gary Alford, one of the things he did was he had read a paper on Bitcoin, and he remembered there was a segment in the paper about this thing called the gambler's ruin. And the gambler's ruin is essentially a thought process that eventually, if you continue to gamble, the house is going to win. Yeah. And he and that was the philosophy that he had. Eventually, if Ross continued to run this website, the house was going to win. And for Ross, if he literally would have walked away 3 weeks earlier, closed his computer, and said, "I want nothing more to do with it," he would have gotten away with tens of millions of dollars, which today, at Bitcoin's valuation, would have been probably worth close to $2 billion. But he just thought he was invincible, and I think that was the that was his downfall. It was hubris.
We're down to the last minute or so. Describe the arrest, because it's incredibly thrilling when they get him literally red-handed.
Well, they knew that this FBI agent Chris Tarbell had done a number of cybersecurity cases, and he knew that you needed the evidence on the person's computer to be able to catch them. And to try them. And so they needed to ensure that they got Ross on his computer And it was an incredible, tense moment in a public library in San Francisco where some agents posed and faked a fight, and they managed to get him just in time.
And it was really incredible because normally they would have wanted, the FBI would have forced a SWAT team, which would have ensured he didn't get caught with it live logged in. We'll look at the cyber forensics for catching this dark web criminal in our final segment with Nick next. And we're back with Nick Bilton. He's the author of American Kingpin, The Epic Hunt for the Criminal Mastermind Behind the Silk Road. We'll look at the forensics now. First off, how confident are you, and how do you know there's not more than one Dread Pirate Roberts?
I couldn't be more confident about anything on planet or Earth that Ross Ulbricht was the only Dread Pirate Roberts. I have been doing investigative journalism for more than almost 15 years. When I write a book, I spend thousands of hours. I have researchers that work with me. We get every single solitary, minute detail that we can, and then we, almost in the same way that FBI agents put a case together, we unravel it in the opposite direction. And one of the things that we did was we took all of Ross's social media feeds. You got to understand, Ross for many years spent the majority of his day on the internet, whether he was logged into the Silk Road as a Dread Pirate Roberts, chatting with his employees, or writing diary entries on his computer, or blog posts as the Dread Pirate Roberts on the website. And from the personal side, from Ross's side, he communicate while he was doing all those things. He would bounce back and forth and communicate with his friends on social media and through email and so on and so forth. And one of the things we did was we got all of that information. We took all of his social feeds, videos he liked and shared, photos from his phone, literally 2.1 million words of chat logs.
Wow.
And we put everything together in his entire Facebook feed with photos and status updates and comments. We put it all together in a database. And what we could do with all those different things is we could, and then we took evidence from the trial, which was a 3.5-week trial with thousands and thousands of pages of evidence. And what we could do is we could put the database together and we could look at where the Dread Pirate Roberts was on a certain day at a certain time and what he was doing, and look at what Ross was doing. And whenever Ross traveled, the Dread Pirate Roberts was said he was offline because he was traveling. And whenever Ross went on a camping trip one weekend, he was away for the whole weekend. He told, and I have photos from the camping trip and GPS location of where he was and all these things. He told his employees to watch the site. He met a girl when he was on the camping trip, and they fell in love. And when he came back, he was at the Dread Pirate Roberts. He was telling the employees that he met this girl on his camping trip, and they fell in love. And one of the defense points was that he was framed by someone else, and that they had put these chat logs and things on his computer. It would take, I'm not even over-exaggerating, thousands of people, thousands of hours over months to be able to manipulate these chat logs to match his social media feed in the way that they did. And so to me, there's just no doubt.
You say, I think you found 100 instances where you could coordinate the Wi-Fi movements of at the same time, both these guys, right, Dread, the alter ego and Ulbricht.
And then there's an example when he goes to Dominica, he's offline I have the flight itinerary because that was used in evidence, and the flight itinerary shows he took 3 planes, and he literally logs on from different locations and different time zones in those connection points every single time he goes to Dominica. He goes to Dominica. He tries to get a citizenship when he needs to go on the run. When he comes back to San Francisco, he's under a pseudonym, telling people he's got a different name. He's paying for things in cash. His girlfriend at the time knew what was going on for a while. One of his friends did. There's so much overwhelming evidence. Nothing.
A big
points elsewhere.
A big, strong forensic evidence. Two things is that number one, his defense is he started it, and then it got so out of control he let it go, so he was no longer involved. But when the FBI did that, surrounded him and picked him up, he was live on all 3 of the admin sites of Silk Road, right?
Yeah, I think that I think one of the problems was he didn't have a very good defense. I think he hired a lawyer who was great with some really incredible cases before, but he wasn't a lawyer who was familiar with tech, and I think that played against him. And the other thing that was frustrating for me, and I think for a lot of people I've spoken to, is that Ross, as the Dread Pirate Roberts, talked about how he was willing to get the death penalty over these beliefs, over the fact that drugs should be legal and these libertarian views. And I admire that. I think he had something he truly believed in, and he wanted to make a difference in the world in the way he saw. But when he was caught, he took the complete opposite approach and denied that he had anything to do with it, and so on and so forth. And I think that, I think that people, he would have had I think he probably would have had a better result if he would have taken the stand and said, I did this, I believe the drug system is screwed up. And how would the prosecution have been able to argue that?
And so you think it was a fundamental mistake not to take a 10-year plea deal, 10 to life, that he was offered, because he's been given life without parole plus 40 more, right? Something like that?
Oh yeah, I think it's probably one of his biggest regrets, I would imagine. Maybe I don't know. I can't speak for exactly what his biggest regret is, but I'm sure it's one of them. He was offered a deal, and he, back to that hubris, he believed he could beat the case. And the prosecution said to him, look, this is it. And at first he was going to take the deal, from what I heard, and then he wasn't, and so on and so forth. And I get the fear of asking for 10 to life, but I guarantee if Ross Ulbricht, a white kid from Austin, Texas, with a master's degree, would have said, hey, look, I started this thing. I'm really sorry. It got so out of control. I didn't even know what was going on. He would have gotten 10 years, maybe even less. But he believed he could beat the case.
The two thumb drives were found by his bed as well, which contained the Bitcoin assets he had or whatever. Is there any way those could have been fudged or set up?
Well, I mean, who's setting them up? Is it the FBI?
It's a good question.
Okay, so let's just take the approach that he was set up, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to, first of all, create 2.1 million words of chat logs and videos and files and documents about the Silk Road and all these things. You have to get them onto his computer without him knowing. Someone who is incredibly smart would notice if all these things showed up on his computer. You have to get diary entries that knew things about Ross that no one else knew, that referenced friends and girlfriends and things like that. You had to make sure every timestamp from every photo that you had never even seen, that had never even been posted on the internet, matched up perfectly with all those chat logs. And then at the same time, not only did you have to set him up to be caught in the library with his hands logged in onto this computer and being like, oh, my God, how did that happen? And then you have to sneak into his house and put 2 thumb drives on his side of his bedside table, and that had the entire Silk Road and all those Bitcoins, tens of millions of dollars, which you're going to just throw away to set this guy up. It makes no sense whatsoever. Let me
ask you this, too. This seemed very incriminating to me, too. He partitioned his laptop so that it had separate directories for files for Silk Road and for his personal Ross Ulbricht. I mean, isn't that pretty incriminating?
Well, there's people that partition their laptop all the time, especially if you're a programmer. So the thing that was incriminating was the fact that when he was logged in, he had his laptop partitioned, and on one side of it, he did all the Ross Ulbricht stuff, like go on Facebook and email his friends and so on and so forth. And then on the other side, he would do the Silk Road stuff. And one of the things that, like, there are these moments that are just, you just couldn't make up. And for example, there was he had a diary that he used to put on his computer, that he'd always kept a diary, Ross Ulbricht. And he in the diary entry, he mentions that he got poison ivy from climbing in a tree. And he had also emailed his girlfriend, and I have the email, saying that he got poison ivy. And he did, but he didn't say how when he told her. And he had told friends, and he even told the FBI agent, because the FBI agent was like, "Hey, well, how'd you get that? How'd you get the poison ivy?" Just being friendly with him. And he had said he climbed up into a tree to get a garbage bag, and he got poison ivy. And so there's all these the triumvirate of all these different things that no one outside of that little world would have known. Mm-hmm. So it's just impossible to say that anyone else was running that site except him.
Now, Lynn has called it a media lynching, and she's critical of you, that he never exhibited any violence. He wasn't even charged for murder. There were no murders. His Fourth Amendment rights were violated, and that supposedly someone had logged into the site as DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts, after Ross was in jail. So what do you think of those issues?
Well, look, I mean, I can't imagine for, what it must be like for Lynn to see her son in jail for the rest of his life. Just, putting aside how you feel about drugs and if they should be legal and if they shouldn't and what Ross did, it's just, it must be devastating. And in the book, the first, at the end of the book, the first thing I write is that and how bad I feel for them. And I, she has every right to hate the book and what it says. But I think that, I did, when I wrote this book, I've been doing this for so long, and I understand how the words I write affect other people. Mm-hmm. And I made a really conscious effort to ensure that people realize that Ross was not a bad guy, who, he wasn't like some sociopath that wanted to, go around killing people, that these things, that this was something that kind of got out of hand. And in his mind, it was something that he was, making the world a better place with. And so, I think that I feel confident with everything I wrote, and I think I was fair to Ross as much as I could be. And one of the biggest complaints, I had a lot of people from law enforcement that were unhappy with the book because they thought I was too nice to Ross. And so, you can't necessarily please anyone, I guess.
What's your answer technically to the login issue that somebody logged in there, which, by the way, shows to me would be if there were other Dread Pirate Roberts, there'd be a ton of other logins, but I guess there was one or two or something, or
there was one login 7 weeks after Ross was, and I looked into it, and it wasn't someone didn't log in and take $20 million in Bitcoin. Uh-huh. And there are millions of dollars in Bitcoin that are still sitting on the other side of Ross's laptop that the government could never get.
That's what I was going to get. So not all the Bitcoins have been accounted for?
Not all the Bitcoins have been accounted for, and not all, and those Bitcoins, they're gone because, unless Ross gets out and ends up getting that laptop back and they're vanished money.
Were they on the Ross Ulbricht side of his PC, which they can't get into?
That's what law enforcement believes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But so what was this?
So back to the
yes.
Back to the so when Ross was taken down, the people who worked for him hadn't been arrested yet, and they all they wanted to immediately build a Silk Road 2 to tell the government, hey, screw you. And so they took all the code that they had, all of his employees, and they were testing it all. And as far as I have heard, one of the employees turned out had a login for the forums for the Dread Pirate Roberts, for the chats. And they logged in and quickly logged out, and that was the last time it ever happened, and the first and last time. But they didn't log into the mastermind part of the site. They didn't. They didn't take any Bitcoins and cash them. I think it's just a coincidence that people like to point to as the one thing that says it wasn't Ross Ulbricht.
To me, it actually proves that there's not others, because it wouldn't have been a one-time thing. As we finish up, tell us what the status of the dark web today. Are there new Silk Roads? Do we need regulation? Is morality a big issue if we're selling organs and sex trade and all this kind of stuff? Terrorism?
Well, that's, the one big worry that a lot of the law enforcement people had, especially Jared, was not necessarily about the drugs that were being sold in there, but it was that terrorists could use it to come into the country and buy drugs or guns or whatever it is, and do whatever they intended to do. This is, of course, pre-people driving cars into crowds, but it was definitely something that they worried about and still do worry about. And the folks who created Tor, who worked for the government, for the U.S. Navy Research Institute, put an announcement out a few weeks ago saying that how dismayed they are that Tor is now 95% of the usage of it is for nefarious purposes, for people who are doing bad things and buying and selling bad things. And there was another website called Alphabet, which took the Silk Road's place and was massive. And that was just shut down a few weeks ago. And the guy who was caught hung himself in a prison cell in Thailand.
Wow.
But there are still hundreds of other websites out there.
Could the feds technically take down the Tor web browser? No,
because it's not. It doesn't. It's not a. The feds don't have the right to. It's and it's also the thing. It's you can, in the same way you can't have. I mean, they could maybe put out some sort of update that would kill the software, but I don't think there's any way of putting the genie back in the bottle
forever.
And even if they did, people would come up with something else.
Last thing, the libertarian philosophy that drove his idealism. Do you see that, and what happened with him, that it can be a real danger?
Oh, absolutely. I think the libertarian. I mean, one of the things that I did when I was doing the reporting was I spoke to folks that adhered to the same philosophy, and I spoke to people he went to college with who had followed that same philosophy, and I was fascinated to understand how he was able to kind of justify the actions that he had taken, even with the so-called murders, and there's they pointed me to articles that Ross had read and even papers he'd written and so on that did point to those justifications. And I think that it's one of the things that's so frustrating about Silicon Valley is the fact that it's the same philosophy. Peter Thiel, who helped get Donald Trump into the White House, has that philosophy. It's not my fault. Whatever happens after I do my thing, as long as my thing is clean. And I think it's an incredibly destructive, selfish way of living, and I just don't necessarily agree with
there's billions of dollars behind the Silicon Valley libertarians, so it is very interesting.
Yep.
It's been the book is thrilling, page turner, as well as all the brilliance of putting together the dark web and bitcoins to go out and sell drugs like a kingpin. Thanks to Nick Bilton, and the book is in fact called American Kingpin, the epic hunt for the criminal mastermind behind the Silk Road. We'll see everybody next Monday night on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.